Well, now we're going to hear a presentation by Donovan Ripkema. Don Ripkema is a principal of Place Economics and president of Heritage Strategies International. Working at the nexus of historic preservation and economic development, he has undertaken assignments in 49 states and 45 countries. He is a director of Global Urban Development, a member of the Senior Advisory Board of the Global Heritage Fund, and the author of The Economics of Historic Preservation. Don holds a master's degree in historic preservation from Columbia University, and he teaches preservation economics at the University of Pennsylvania. Hello, Don. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it. So thanks very much for including me in this great webinar. In Tom's presentation, he talked about a series of the ways that old places matter, and economics was near the last of that list, and that, in fact, is where it should be. Of all of the values of historic preservation, I truly, absolutely believe that the economic value is the least important, but as the great economist John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. And in the short run, it's often the economic argument that's necessary to convince the mayor, city council members, developers, property owners about the value of historic preservation. So what I want to do today is talk about the ways that historic preservation adds to the local economy. And there's been about 20 years of research in this direction. And whether I've done the studies or some other firm has done it, there's generally the big four that emerge. One of those is the role of historic buildings in successful downtown revitalization efforts, particularly in Main Street, which is downtown revitalization in the context of historic preservation. The incremental difference of heritage tourism, the jobs and household income that are created simply by the process of rehabilitating historic buildings, and the impact of local historic designation on property values. So I'll talk about, to start with each of those. A year ago or so, we finished a study of the North Carolina Main Street program. And North Carolina was one of the original Main Street states. And so they have 30 years worth of data about how this downtown revitalization effort in the context of historic buildings has paid off for North Carolina. And one of the things that we learned in that study is cumulatively, over that almost 30-year period, over $2 billion with a B dollars have been invested in those Main Street towns. About half of that from the private sector, the other half in public sector investment in buildings, in landscaping, and street sidewalks. Over that same time period, the net new businesses have been over 4,500 in these Main Street communities. Every month, these Main Street managers in North Carolina have to make a report. This is how many businesses opened. This is how many closed. This is how many people were hired. These are how many people lost their jobs. So these are all net numbers recognizing the change over that time period. It's also been about 18,000 net new jobs. And when you take those two numbers, the number of net new jobs and the number of net new businesses, just kind of makes sense. About 3.5 jobs per business, and that's what most small independent operators in downtowns are. There's been about 4,500 rehabilitation of buildings in those North Carolina Main Street communities. And then if you look at it from the cost effectiveness perspective, since the beginning of the program, North Carolina Main Street has gotten about $7.7 million of taxpayers' money to run the program. In a few years, they've gotten additional monies for grant programs. If you add that in, the total budget in the Main Street program over the lifetime is a little less than $12 million. But if you take that budget, divide it by the number of net new jobs, it's at $435 a job. Or even if you add the grant money, $668 per job. Well, if you're a state's economic development director and you go and say, I created a new job for $25,000 a job, you'd get a standing ovation from the state legislature. And here, Main Street's been doing it for $400 or $500 a job. $2,500 net cost per new business. But the real important number, particularly for those of the inclination saying we should be frugal with taxpayers' dollars, the leverage of that public expenditure in Main Street versus the private investment, $145 to 1. and in fact, $140 of public investment made in those Main Street communities for every dollar that the taxpayers put in the state Main Street program. Second broad area of the Big Four is heritage tourism. And here's where there's been consistent research, not just in the United States, but really around the world about the incremental difference of heritage-based tourism. Excuse me, a study done a few years ago in the southeast corner of Pennsylvania looked at that heritage-based tourism in the Philadelphia area, $3 billion in economic activity, 45,000 jobs, almost $1 billion in earnings. Huge numbers, but Philadelphia is the cradle of American democracy and lots of historic resources. Big numbers, no big surprise, but Arkansas. Only 16% of the visitors to Arkansas are considered heritage tourists, but they spend 30% more than other visitors. They're more likely to be out of state, and it's that out of state visitor that affects really a state's economy. And even though it's a relatively small share of the total tourism, it's 21,000 jobs, $319 million in income, and importantly for state legislators trying to stretch scarce dollars, $74 million in tax revenues from the heritage portion of Arkansas's tourism industry. Florida is a state that we think of Disney World or the beaches or golf, but almost half of all U.S. visitors who go to Florida for whatever reason, in fact, visit an historic site while they're there. And it's over $4 billion a year just in the heritage portion of Florida's tourism industry. The U.S. Department of Commerce does a good job of surveying international visitors who come to the United States by plane. And so that eliminates the daily crossover from Canada and Mexico. And what they found for cultural tourists, and again, in tourism, the definitions are a little fuzzy, but about not all cultural tourists are heritage tourists. All heritage tourists would be cultural tourists, and probably about 80% of cultural tourists would be heritage tourists. Anyway, what was found is that they spend about half of as many nights in hotel rooms while they're in the States. 470,000 more international visitors visit an historic site than go to the amusement park. 785,000 more visit an historic site than go to the beach. 3 times as many visit historic sites as go to casinos. 4 times as many visit historic sites as play golf. So if we're really trying to capture the real spending of international visitors, we need to look at the heritage visitor portion of that. We recently finished a study in the great city of San Antonio, and we looked at who the visitors are who go there. And we calculated that about 58% of them, of the overnight visitors, would be classified as heritage visitors, a little less than half of the day visitors. But in every one of the expenditure categories, the heritage visitors outspent the others in lodging, in transportation, in food and beverage, in retail, and in recreation. The per trip expenditure of heritage visitors was more than other tourists coming to San Antonio. Some people are involved in historic sites, and there's a really interesting ratio that comes up not just in the U.S., but in fact around the world, is that the historic site might be the magnet that attracted somebody to a place, but that historic site gets a very small portion of that visitor's daily expenditure. In a study we did in Utah, only about 7% of the heritage visitors' dollars go, in fact, to the heritage site they went to visit. 93% went to the hotel, the gas station, the rental car, the retail shop. It was the historic site that drew them, but the others were the major beneficiaries of those expenditures. Then the next of the big four is the jobs and income that are generated simply by the rehabilitation of historic buildings. We did a study in Delaware, and Delaware is still a state that has a significant industrial component. And if in Delaware, if you manufacture $1 million worth of widgets, that creates about 9 jobs in the state of Delaware. If you spend $1 million and build a new building in Delaware, that's about 11 jobs. But spend $1 million rehabilitating an historic building, that's 14.5 jobs. But those jobs have paychecks. So those people manufacturing those widgets, that ends up at about $344,000 in income. New building, $1 million, about $477,000 ends up as paychecks. Rehabilitation of historic building for $1 million, $540,000 in income to Delaware citizens. Georgia has a bit more diverse economy than does Delaware, and so we looked at a whole series of industries in the state of Georgia. And the citizens of Georgia spent $1 gazillion recruiting an automobile manufacturer there, and that's fine, it's their money. But you manufacture $1 million worth of cars in the state of Georgia, that's 3.5 jobs and about $250,000 in salaries and wages. Many of you have had to go through the Atlanta airport, and $1 million worth of those airplane tickets is about 8.5 jobs and $476,000 in income. Build a new $1 million building in Georgia, 15 jobs and $616,000 in income, or spend $1 million rehabilitating a historic building, 18 jobs, $750,000 income. Now, where in that list is the real economic development? And then the last of the big four is the impact of local historic districts on property values. And this is the area that's been looked at probably more often by more people in more parts of the country with different methodologies than any other, with astoundingly consistent findings. That is that properties in historic districts tend to outperform the market as a whole. In Philadelphia, great firm in Philadelphia looked at 30 years of changes of property values in Philadelphia. What they found is that properties in National Register districts generated a premium, a value premium of about 14%. But as you probably know, National Register listing is kind of a nice honorary thing, but there's no protection for the property that comes from National Register listing. If properties are to be protected, it's because they're in a local historic district. Well, there's an even additional premium for being in that local district. Now, it's a bit counterintuitive. Some would argue, well, there's more regulation, and by definition, if there's more regulation, it's going to hurt property values. In fact, consistently, the opposite is true. And it's not that anybody's paying a premium for the privilege of going to some goofy preservation commission. They're paying the premium for the confidence that the person across the street can't do something that has an adverse effect on my property. One of the best studies in the U.S. was done by John Gilderbloom at University of Louisville, and he looked over an 8-year period on a very sophisticated hedonic pricing method in Louisville, and sorted out all of the variables that would account for one property selling for a different amount than another, so that the only difference left was it was in or it was not in a local historic district. And what did he find? That there was a value premium of around $60,000 to $65,000 being in the local historic district, and those properties over the 8-year study period outperformed the market by about 21% in appreciation. We looked in San Antonio over a 15-year period from 1998 to 2013, and as you'll recall, that first half of that time period was kind of real estate appreciation out of control, and then the real estate crash, and then in most parts of the country in the last year or two, some signs of recovery. Well, they have local historic districts in San Antonio. They have conservation districts that are a little less demanding of the resources, and then the rest of the city. Well, the conservation districts outperformed the city as a whole in terms of value change over that time, but outperforming them both were the regulated, protected historic districts. In Connecticut, we looked in Canton, which is north and west of Hartford, and what you're seeing, the pink area is a National Register district. And totally within and covering about a third of the National Register district is a local historic district. So what happened in Canton? The National Register district outperformed the rest of the city. The local historic district with protections, in fact, outperformed the National Register district. In Savannah, we looked at the 5 local historic districts of Savannah, some of them quite wealthy, some of them not wealthy at all, and how their value changed between 1999 and 2014. Every single one of those local historic districts outperformed the city as a whole. So those are the kind of big 4, but as research has grown and more people looking at the issue and more data sources become available, some new measurements have emerged that I'll refer to as the new 9. That's foreclosure, stability on the downside, density, walkability, knowledge and creative industries, the birth-death ratio in business, demographic, economic mirror in historic districts, the environment, and the first place of return. And I'll give you some factoids in each of those areas. And this astounding study that we've now looked at, I think in 14 or 15 U.S. cities, about the rates of foreclosure in historic districts. Consistent response that there's a decidedly less rate of foreclosure in historic districts than in the rest of the city. In Salt Lake, in fact, it was a fourth as much in the historic districts as in the city as a whole. We looked in the city of Raleigh, that the National Register districts had lower rate of foreclosures than the city, and local historic districts even a lower rate. Now, it's not because people who live in historic homes never get divorced, never get fired, never run their credit cards up too much. It is that the economics term for it would be less downside volatility, that if I get in financial trouble, in fact, there's a stronger market. The property has declined less in value, so I can get out from under that property before it reaches the foreclosure process. Here we looked in San Antonio, the same answer. Every historic district had a lower rate of foreclosure than the city as a whole. So how does that translate in terms of stability on the downside? Well, once again, here's what happened in Savannah. That you take the period of 1999 to 2008, and those were years of mostly rapid appreciation in real estate. And what happened to the historic districts? Well, they outperformed the rest of the city. They appreciated more. But then, we had the crash beginning at the end of 2007. So what happened to the down years? Well, the historic district, the decline in values in historic districts started later. It was less steep. It stabilized sooner, and recovery began sooner than did the market as a whole. Now, this is a critical issue. The biggest consequence of that horrible recession was people all over the country losing their house. Well, if in fact there's this consistent pattern of a lower rate of foreclosure, then HUD, the Mortgage Bankers Association, bankers, realtors, developers ought to be paying attention to this statistically significant difference in foreclosure rates. Then there's the issue of density, and many of you are planners, and planners always like to argue about the importance of density for environmental reasons, for fiscal reasons, or for good urbanism reasons. Everybody likes density except the property owner saying, yeah, if I wanted to live in density, I'd live in New York City. But that's a misnomer. Here's the city of Raleigh, and at the beginning of the 20th century, the density in the city of Raleigh was about 7,800 people per square mile. By the beginning of the 21st century, that density had fallen to about 2,300 people, so a fourth of the density a century later in the city of Raleigh. Here's the density of the city as a whole, 2,500 people per square mile. Here's the density in the local historic districts and all the historic districts, twice the density. Now, what's interesting is that if you ask people, oh, you don't like density, tell me the kind of neighborhood you like. They always say, oh, that's historic district. That's the kind of neighborhood that people ought to live in, and that's frequently the densest place in town. But importantly, it's density at a human scale. So we did a little experiment. I have a brilliant young colleague, Bree Paxton, who was working with me on this Raleigh study, and I gave her an assignment. I said, find me two neighborhoods. And the only thing I care about is this, that they be roughly the same size geographically, and that one is an historic neighborhood and one is a relatively new subdivision. So look wherever you want, but those are the only criteria. So she found two. One, Oakwood, which is an historic district in Raleigh, and another, the Reedham Oaks Wyndham subdivision, which is a newer subdivision. And here's the basic statistics. Oakwood has 1,664 people. Reedham just over 500. Both of them are 114 acres in size. Housing units just about 800 in Oakwood, 127 in Reedham. And the average year of construction, 1925 in Oakwood, 1992 in Reedham. And then we started making the rest of the calculations. So the average house size in the historic district, about 2,500 square feet, about 3,500 in the newer subdivision. Average value of the properties, $315,000 in the historic district, $525,000 in Reedham Oaks. Now, this is where the city finance officer saying, yeah, see, this is why I like those new subdivisions. The property values are more, so the property taxes more. Okay, well, let's just take it a step further. The taxes per unit, 2,900 in the historic district, 4,800 in Redham. So now, once again, the finance guy is saying, this is great. This is where we're going to collect our taxes. So let's just follow that through. Population per acre, 14.5 in Oakwood, 4 in Redham Oaks. Square feet of road per dwelling unit, about 1,000 in Oakwood and 2,200 in Redham. And again, that road is going to be permanently maintained by the public taxpayers. Taxes per acre, now the equation begins to change. Taxes per acre in the historic district, 22,000. In the new subdivision, 5,300. Now, sooner or later, you're going to have to replace the water lines and the sewer lines. The cost per unit of water and sewer line replacement in Oakwood, $8,800, almost $25,000 in Redham Oaks. And the annual property taxes from the whole subdivision, $2.3 million in the historic district, $610,000 in Redham Oaks. Now, if you're concerned about the city budget, where is that density paying off? It's paying off in the historic neighborhoods. Then you all know about walkability and what a critical issue and variable that has become in kind of good towns and cities of every size. So we wanted to look at how walkable are historic neighborhoods. So we looked in Connecticut, and we calculated the walk score on every historic tax credit project in the state of Connecticut over a 15-year period. And what we found is that 90% of all of the neighborhoods where these historic buildings existed were in fact the top 2 of the walkability categories. Now, once you hear that, you say, well, of course they are. They were built when there were sidewalks, and they're mixed use where there's density, all of the things that add to the walkability score. Here's in San Antonio, and with the exception of Mission, it's kind of a too big district around the Missions there. Every other historic district, residential historic district in San Antonio, had a better walk score than did the city as a whole. Here's Raleigh again. The city of Raleigh is a low walk score. It's a car-dependent city. The local historic districts at the other end of the spectrum, very walkable. And then there's this kind of natural synergy between the knowledge and creative industries and historic buildings and historic neighborhoods. North Carolina has this kind of a priority to attract more of the creative industry workers. But as a state as a whole, the number's not very great, and it's never going to be a large share of any state's economy. But less than 2% of the workers in North Carolina are in the arts, entertainment, or recreation field. City of Raleigh does a little better. National Register Historic Districts does better than that. And best of all are, in fact, the people who are living in the local historic districts. Here is Savannah, and we looked at knowledge workers in Savannah. The historic districts in Savannah have about 31% of all the jobs in the city, but all of these knowledge categories, finance, insurance, professional technical services, arts, entertainment, recreation, education, all decidedly greater share in the historic districts than their share of all jobs. Then there's this very interesting pattern of business birth and business death. It's a number that the Department of Commerce calculates every year. And it's a really good measure of what's happening in a local economy. And nationally, over the long haul, that ratio will tend to be 1.1 to 1.2 to 1. That is 11 or 12 businesses opening for every 10 that close. And if you look at the kind of last year's, the middle years of the first decade of the century, the average was about typical. 2004, 5, 6 were 1.1, 1.2. The end of 2007 was when the recession began. And then look what happens in 2008, 9, and 10. In fact, more businesses were closed than opening. Therefore, the ratio less than 1. And by 2011, the recovery sort of began, and the ratio is almost back up to 1 to 1, but the same number of businesses opening as are closing. And we compared those national numbers with what was happening in Main Street neighborhoods, economic development in the context of historic preservation in 3 states, in Michigan, in New Mexico, and in North Carolina. Now, as you probably know, North Carolina has a pretty healthy economy. The states of New Mexico and Michigan, in fact, do not, but it didn't matter. In every one of those instances, in every one of those years, the ratio of businesses opening to closing outperformed the national average. What this means is this strategy of downtown revitalization in the context of historic preservation creates a fertile environment for businesses to open, to stay open, for businesses to expand. Then this pattern again that I think is largely unrecognized, and it's the role that historic districts play as really a demographic mirror of the city as a whole. Again, we looked at San Antonio, and we started looking at household income. And as you can see, the two curves, the city as a whole and the population in historic districts, the curves are almost identical. Here's the exception. There was slightly more of the lowest household income and slightly more of the highest in historic districts. And that's hardly a bad thing to happen. And the rest of it was largely a mirror of the city as a whole. So we looked at it this household income distribution, not just aggregated for the city, but at the individual historic districts. And while there's a few exceptions where there's a larger portion of the lowest income or a larger portion of the highest income, for the most part, individually, these historic districts have an income distribution that's a mirror of what the city looks like as a whole. Then we looked at racial distribution in San Antonio. San Antonio doesn't have a large African-American population, about a little less than 7%, but virtually the same in historic districts as the city as a whole. What's more significant in a city like San Antonio is the Hispanic population. And once again, the population in the historic districts was just about the same as in the city as a whole. And again, when you take it out of the aggregated basis and look at individual historic districts, the same answer. A few of them have slightly more Hispanic population, a few of them slightly less Hispanic population, but for the most part, they're consistent in that Hispanic, non-Hispanic spread at the neighborhood level as is the city as a whole. And then the area that really is a kind of new area of research in historic preservation, and that is the contribution of historic buildings to the environment. A great study was done a couple of years ago in Maryland by an investment banker and environmental economist. And here was their measurement. They said, let's say that we had two choices. We could take a 50,000 square foot existing historic warehouse and rehabilitate it and make it energy efficient. And our other choice is to go to the edge of town and build a new 50,000 square foot warehouse. So when we're done, in either case, we have the building with the same utility. What are the environmental differences of those two decisions? Well, on all of these environmental measurements, vehicle miles traveled, travel costs, CO2 emissions, embodied energy are all better, environmentally better, rehabilitating the existing warehouse than building new. Greenfield at the edge of town is 5 acres that are eaten up when we build that warehouse at the edge of town as opposed to reusing the existing warehouse, less construction break. And then for those who care about the fiscal side of things, between $500,000 and $800,000 saved in infrastructure costs by reusing the existing warehouse instead of building new. The Sierra Club and the Tea Party ought to be holding hands leading the preservation parade. This reuse of infrastructure with existing buildings saves between 50 and 80% in infrastructure costs. For those city council members and state legislators are saying we've got to save taxpayers' dollars, well, then you ought to be saving historic buildings because that's how you save those taxpayer dollars. Mayor Bloomberg in New York wanted to set the city on the path to become the greenest city in the world. And good businessman that he is, he said we got to start out by doing an energy audit of our existing buildings. And so they did tens of thousands of buildings. And what they learned was, in fact, the opposite of what environmentalists have been telling us for decades. And that is, you've got to tear down those old buildings. They're big energy hogs, and that's bad for the environment. Well, in fact, the opposite was true. The ones that made what were the least consumptive of energy per square foot were the buildings built before 1930. Every decade that followed, in fact, the energy use per square foot increased, not decreased. If we want to tear down some buildings, just tear down those crappy buildings built in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that are energy hogs and make sure that we're using our historic buildings. Mike mentioned this in his presentation, but there's great research, peer-reviewed, robust research that the Green Lab has done on the energy efficiency of rehabilitated historic buildings. And then this issue about the first place of return. Many of your cities are growing in population, and that's wonderful, but some of your cities are shrinking in population. You're trying to hang on to who you've got and hope that sometime in the future people start coming back. Well, Philadelphia is a city that for 50 years lost population. And in the 2010 census, they finally had a little uptick. And big headlines in Philadelphia, the corner has been turned, we're gaining population, we're up 8,400 people. Well, in fact, that wasn't the case at all. The historic districts in Philadelphia gained 12,000 people. The rest of the city, in fact, still lost population. And then Washington, where I live, same pattern. Finally, the corner's been turned in terms of losing population for decades. About 45% of the population of Washington lives in historic districts, but those historic districts attracted about 63% of the population growth in Washington. In Boston, the turnaround began a decade earlier. And where did that population first go to? It was not the city in general. It was to historic neighborhoods in Boston. That's about 23% of the population in Boston lives in historic districts, but that was where 36% of the population growth took place when they finally turned the corner. So the lesson in all of this is the list of why old places matter from the economic side is very long, and it's growing every year. Thank you very much for letting me participate in this.
Well, thank you very much, Don. I'd like to just, before we go away, just have one follow-up question for you, if you will. And this is one that came up a lot. How can preservation advocates, based, in light of everything that you've shared with us, how can they work effectively with small business organizations, chambers of commerce, and even the city or town itself to strengthen the economic health of these older main streets?
Well, I think that it's a great question. I think there's a couple things in that regard. Number one, the people who are advocates for preservation rarely become advocates because they like doing compounded, discounted internal rate of return on 14 decimal points on an after-tax basis. They get involved because of those other lists, the other reasons that Tom mentioned about the sense of identity, the sense of continuity, a whole range of other reasons. So I think in the economic side, we literally have to grit our teeth and talk the language of business, of banking, of public finance, so we can make our case not just in those other measures, but on economic grounds as well. Again, not just more important, it just needs to be one of the arguments that we made. Second, I think that we need to point out to people like small business people and chambers of commerce and banks this important contributory role that and opportunity that historic buildings make. And third, I think it's often unrecognized, is here every town in America is competing not just with a county seat or the town 15 miles away. They're literally competing with every town and city in the world. We can no longer escape that. Well, if you're going to compete, you're not going to compete by being the same as every place else. You're going to compete by being different than other places. It's differentiation that commands a monetary premium. And in towns and cities all over America, among the chief differentiators are the historic resources, and we need to recognize that.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Is there any closing thoughts you have beyond your presentation?
No, I just think that I'm really happy with this webinar and who is sponsoring it, because I'd argue that there really can't be a comprehensive smart growth approach if historic preservation and downtown revitalization are a central component of that strategy.